Good evening. That brings us around to 8:10, and we're really grateful to welcome back Stephen, and he's going to be doing the second part of the talk on blue lines, following on from Tuesday. As mentioned last time, the slides will be available after the talk, so you don't need to worry about that. The link will be in the follow-up email that's sent tomorrow evening. And then I think the only other thing to mention is, again, we're going to operate the system where people should ask questions in the chat window. Do send them to everyone, just so that you can see what other people are saying. Yeah, we'll hand over to Stephen.
Hello, everybody. Right, let's get this set up. Thank you all for coming back. Hopefully everybody who's here was here on Tuesday as well. Hopefully anybody who wasn't able to come back live this evening will be able to catch up with this on online. Now I just need to remember how I set this up to share my screen. Here's the share screen button, and here is the slideshow. Okay, great. Hopefully everybody can see that. So yes, I'll just carry on from where we left off the other night, and I'm fairly certain we should be able to get through to the end of what I have prepared before 9 p.m. certainly. So last time we went through what a method is. We had a little bit of a look at some history of where blue lines came from. We looked at what a method diagram, blue line and all, looks like. We talked about the stages on which we ring the methods, and there were some interesting comments in the in the chat about where the even numbered stage names come from. So that was interesting to read. Thank you very much for those who contributed. We then looked at place notation, and hopefully I was able to describe how place notation works in a reasonably understandable way. And then we got part way through looking at the different types of method that there are. So that's where we're going to continue on from. So let's have a look at the diagram that I started describing. So if you remember, there was a dynamic box up at the top, which I cut out. Those methods are not very commonly rung. They're interesting, but I think a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm talking about. So we're looking at static methods, which are basically methods that have a set length in the plain course. Last time we looked at principles, which include things like Stedman and plain hunt, where all of the bells do the same line. There's no hunt bell. We then went on to look at hunters, and we got kind of halfway through this section. We'd looked at plain hunters, which are mainly plain bob type methods. The hunt bell follows plain hunt path, and the other bells do dodging and places and so on. This is termed plain bob hunter. We finished by looking at the treble dodging methods. So these are the methods in which the hunt bell treble bob hunts. Many people will be familiar with that. And we just had a look at the technical differences between these three subtypes of treble dodging methods. So the treble bob methods, the surprise methods, and the delight methods. So we'll move on from here. Now, I think it's worth noting at this point that most of the methods that we ring fall within the hunter category. There are some principles, but there's not that many of them, and there are a few that are rung very regularly, but only 2 or 3 are actually rung on a regular basis. So most of what we ring are either plain hunters or treble dodging hunters, and so really we've covered the vast majority of what people are used to. But we will just go and have a look at these 2 treble place and alliance methods. We will talk a little bit about little hunters as well. They're in a separate little circle on their own, and we'll discuss why that is. And then I will look at differentials as well, because they're quite interesting. So let's move on from treble dodging hunters to treble place hunters. So if you remember, with the treble dodging hunters, we had some definitions that tell us how the hunt bell moves, and that's what defines those methods as treble dodging hunters. Well, in treble place hunters, the rules are pretty similar, except that the hunt bell makes a place more than twice during the lead. So if you remember from the treble dodging hunters, the hunt bell was only making a place twice, once at the front of the lead and once at the back. And everywhere else, there were no places made. We only had dodges. So in treble place hunters, this is not true. There's more than one place made during the lead. Now, the other two rules remain the same. So the hunt bell rings more than twice in each position during a lead. So that differentiates it from a plain hunter. But it has to ring the same number of times in each position throughout the lead. These can happen on both odd and even stages. So whereas treble dodging methods, we had to have them on even stages due to this restriction of not making more than one place, making more than two places during the lead, we can now have these on odd and even stages. Most treble place hunters are basically treble dodging hunters, but the treble, instead of dodging in say 1, 2 or 5, 6, makes places. And we can see an example of this on the right here. We've got the normal treble bob hunting in 3, 4 and 1, 2, but in 5, 6 we drop the dodges and we actually have a set of places made, which is different from treble dodging, obviously. The hunt bell path can be more complicated than this, so that there are some methods where we have dodge, lead, dodge on the front, but then the hunt bell goes all the way out to the back, makes a place, comes back into thirds and makes a place, and then goes back out again. Those sorts of things are possible. And if you have a look at some of the treble place hunters, then you'll see these slightly more complicated hunt bell paths. So that means that some of these treble place hunters are what would be termed trivial variations of what would be considered more recognizable treble bob hunters. So here we've got Cambridge treble place minor, and for those who are familiar with Cambridge surprise major, which is a treble dodging method, you'll see that this is essentially the same, except that the work during third place bell is slightly different with these places instead of dodging with the hunt bell. But as we discussed, we can have more complex hunt bell paths, and so some of the treble place some of the treble place hunter methods are quite different to what we would normally think of as a kind of normal standard method. So that's treble place hunters. And next we have alliance hunters. So an alliance hunter is sort of an in-between halfway house. So the hunt bell does not ring the same number of times in each position during a lead. There are some positions where it rings more and other positions where it rings fewer times during the course of its lead. So again, these are possible on odd and even stages. And on the whole, the hunt bell path in the alliance methods is usually a combination of treble bob hunting and plain hunting. So the example I've given here is Winchcombe alliance, which is sort of a bit like double Oxford bob minor, for those who are familiar with that method, except that instead of plain hunting, as it does in double Oxford bob, the hunt bell here plain hunts out to the back, but then we have treble bob hunting in 5, 6, and then we revert back to plain hunt here. So these are kind of a bit of a mashup of plain hunters and treble dodging plus or minus treble place hunting methods. Next, I'm just going to come on to little hunters. Now, some of you may have been sitting there wondering, when's little bob going to be mentioned? Little hunters are, if you remember the diagram, we're in a circle on their own, and that's because multiple types of methods can be little methods. not just plain hunters, also surprise, delight, treble bob, and so on can be little hunters. So that's what I've just said. Essentially, all method types in the hunter group can be little hunters, and in the little hunters, the hunt bell follows the rules for that specific type of hunter. So if it's a little surprise, then it has to follow the rules for the treble dodging methods, but it doesn't ring in all of the positions during each lead. So there are some positions in the change where the hunt bell never gets to. Usually this means that it starts at the front, starts from lead, and turns around before it gets all the way to the back. So obviously many people will understand what I'm saying because they know little bob, minor or major or whatever stage, that the treble in this case hunts out to fourth place. Instead of going all the way out to the back, it then makes its place in fourths and goes down to lead. You can see that the hunt bell here is following the rules for a plain hunter method. So it's only making 2 places during each lead, and it spends 2 blows in each position through its lead. It's just not going all the way out to the back. So that's why it's little rather than just plain bob minor. I'd say that little bob and Basto little bob are probably the most commonly rung little methods. Other people may want to mention little methods that they ring often as well. But it's worth saying that it's not just plain methods that have little variations, as we've already discussed, and actually little surprise methods are sometimes rung at higher stages, so on large number of bells. And a common one in that category is little port little surprise. I believe that in little port little Maximus, the treble bobs to 8th place and then goes back in, although please correct me if that's wrong. So that's little methods, and as we've said, can be applied to any of those subcategories of of hunter type methods. And finally, we're going to look at differentials. Now, I find these methods quite interesting, although I must say I've never actually rung one of them. So that maybe goes to show that they're not particularly common. Until fairly recently, they were not recognized as proper methods by the rules of the Central Council, although they have been now for several years, and these are perfectly valid methods to ring. So what are they? Well, a differential is defined as a method where the working bells don't all reach their starting positions after the same number of leads. So if we just flick back very quickly to little bob minor, we can see that the working bells here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leads, they've all got back to the position that they started in. And that is true of all of the methods that we've discussed so far, but it's not true for differentials. So what does that mean? Well, essentially, these are methods with more than one blue line. So we have at least 2 bells on each of those blue lines. Now, there can be 2, but there can be more than 2 blue lines in differentials, and some of the differential Maximus methods can have even 5 groups of bells. They can still have hunt bells in them, and they're then termed as differential hunters. So it's possible to have a method where there is a hunt bell, which may be following a plain hunt path or a treble dodging path, or any of the paths we've talked about, as well as having then 2 or more groups of bells that are doing what we would term work. So 2 or more blue lines in addition to the hunt bell. If there isn't a hunt bell, then as with principals, the length of the lead isn't fixed. The length of the lead is as long as it takes for the bells on each line to finish each section of work and start the work of another bell. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of these methods is that the length of a plain course is not always obvious. So I've got an example on 6 bells on the right here. Now, I don't know really how to pronounce this, Orin or Orin, differential minor. Now, at first glance, you may think that this is just a treble dodging hunter method. You see the red line here follows exactly the treble bob hunting path. But if you look here at the lines split apart, you can see that actually on this red path, we have two bells. We have the 6 and the 1. So if we look at the red path from the treble, which is highlighted, treble bob hunts out to the back. But if we actually follow the line of the 6 from the beginning of the method, we can see that it's doing exactly the same, just starting at this point here. So in our first group, we have 6 and 1. And in the second group, we have the rest of the bells, so 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can see that when you overlay these, we get back to rounds after 4 leads, which is different to the normal number of leads on a minor method, which would be 5 if there was only 1 hunt bell, 6 if it was a principal, or 4 if there were 2 hunt bells. But not all differentials are like that. So let's have a quick look at when a differential actually ends. So as we said, normally the number of leads in a plain course is the same as the number of working bells. In differentials, however, the number of leads depends on the number of bells in each group. And we can actually define the number of leads as the smallest number that can be divided by the number of bells in each of the groups. So that's the number we've got to look for to find out how long our methods last. So let's try and display that in an easier to understand way. So taking the example that we've just looked at, we had 6 bells, we had 1 group of 2 and 1 group of 4. So after 1 lead, if we imagine that on the left here we've got our group of 2 and on the right we've got our group of 4, after 1 lead, the bells in the first group have progressed halfway through their path on the way back to where they started, whereas the bells in the second group have progressed a quarter of the way. So then we ring a second lead. The bells in the group of 2 have made it back to where they started, but we don't have rounds because the bells in the group of 4, they're only halfway through getting back to where they began. So we'll ring a third lead. These 2 have got halfway through again, and now we're 3/4 of the way. And if we ring a 4th lead, then you can see we're back where we started in both of these groups. So that matches with what we saw on the previous slide, that R in differential minor has 4 leads in its plain course. But what about if we add another couple of bells and look at a group of 3 and a group of 5 that are doing 2 different lines? Well, using the same sort of setup, let's see what happens. So we've rung 1 lead here, and these 3 bells are 1/3 of the way through their path, but here we're only 1/5 of the way. Now, I'm not going to describe this every time, but I will just flick through. So after 3 leads, the group of 3 has got back to the beginning, but they're not matching up with the group of 5. So we need to go for at least 3 more. Here we go after 6 leads. These are back at the beginning again, but we're still not matching up with the group of 5. So we'll go for another 3. We're close, but we're still not there. How about a 4th round? No, not quite. And actually, after 15 leads, we do get back to where we started in both of these groups. So they continue to cycle through their paths. They're kind of just missing each other as they get back to where they start. The other lot aren't quite there. And eventually, after 15 leads, we get back to the beginning and we would have rounds. So we can see that 15 is the smallest number that we can divide by both 3 and 5. And as many of you will see, it's actually the product of multiplying 3 by 5 as well. So that's a very interesting property of differential methods. And maybe one of the most famous differential methods that has been rung is this one called double helix differential major. This has a group of 3 and a group of 5 on 8 bells. So this is the same as the example we've just looked at. It has 15 leads in its plain course, but each of those leads is 112 changes long. So a plain course of double helix differential major is actually several hundred changes longer than a quarter peal. So just ringing a plain course of this method will score you a quarter peal. No bobs or singles needed. So perhaps the easiest method of all to ring a quarter peal to. until you look at the blue lines, and then you realize that it's not quite so simple. So that rounds off that section on different types of method. Perhaps people have come across there some different types that they weren't aware of. But all of them are perfectly valid methods, and there's absolutely no reason not to ring some of them. So, so do go ahead and see if you can find some exciting alliance or perhaps differential methods, and have a go if you can convince the rest of the band. So very quickly, I'm going to look at method naming and extension. Now, these are topics, especially extension, which is really beyond the scope of what I'm talking about tonight. But I thought it would be worth mentioning. Where do the names of methods come from? Well, the title of a method consists of 3 parts. I apologize to anyone who's colorblind. It may not be obvious that these are all in separate colors, so sorry for that. But first, we've got the method name. Then we've got the method classification, which is what we've just been talking about. And we've got the stage, which we covered the other night. So we can look at a commonly rung method, Cambridge surprise major. So here, Cambridge is the name of that method. Surprise is the classification, the type of method that it is. And major is the stage. So here we're ringing on 8 bells. And this is generally how methods are named. So you can get that information out of them. This gives it its unique definition. Then we've got the type and the number of bells. There are a few exceptions to this rule, mostly very old traditional methods which have escaped the rules of the Central Council. So Granser is one of those. Granser major, sorry, not major, we'll stick with more common forms. Granser triples doesn't have a method classification part, a type. Technically, it would be Granser Bob because it's a plain Bob Hunter type. But we don't say Granser Bob, we just call it Granser. There are a few others that are exceptions like that. The main reason to talk about this is to say that previously unrung methods can be named by the first band to ring them. So if you ever wonder why methods get their names, if they're old, it's probably a very traditional name, but if they're new, then they can be named by the first band to ring them, which is why there are methods such as Desperate Housewives Surprise Major, which I think is a real one. Some people take it more seriously than others. The names do have to abide by the rules of the Central Council to be accepted. But these days, if you ring the methods either in a quarter peal, I think is allowed, or on lower stages, just ringing an extent. So on 5 bells or 120, it is enough to be able to then report the method. It needs to be published in the ringing world, along with the new name and the place notation. But as long as you abide by the rules that are set, then you can name your own methods. Moving on to extensions. So as we'll all be aware, many methods can and are extended, or also perhaps contracted, to be rung at some or all of the different stages. So basically on different numbers of bells. We know that there's plain Bob minimus all the way up to plain Bob 16 at all of the stages. The rules for extension are complicated, and I'm really not going to go into them in any detail, mainly because I don't understand them myself. Some extensions seem very obvious. So plain Bob is a good example of that. It's very clear that you keep adding dodges or long places at the back in odd stages, but you just keep adding those on, and that extends the method out, and it works perfectly fine. But there are others that are not so straightforward, and actually there can be multiple different possibilities when you move from one stage to the next. A good example of this is London Surprise. So there's London Surprise Major, which some people may have rung in the past, but there isn't a single London Surprise Royal. There are actually 4 named London Surprises Royal that can all be looked up with slightly different lines. All of them are valid extensions of London Major, and there are probably a number of others which would be valid extensions and just haven't been named. Now, this is something that somebody else may talk about another time, but I'm not going to go any further than that. Like I say, big part of that is that I just don't understand it. But just to make clear that whilst we can extend methods, it's not always simple to move from one stage to the next. So that's a large part of what I want to say in terms of kind of introducing perhaps new types of method and so on. So I'm going to finish up with a few slides on how we can actually use the things that I've been talking about to help us with our ringing. You know, is this just for interest, or is some of this actually helpful? So we're going to go through a few points here. Hopefully I'll get through them in not too much time, and we'll finish up before 9 p.m. So we're going to talk about circles of work versus blue lines. Then we'll look at using the hunt bell as a landmark, and we'll talk here about lead ends and place bells particularly. Then I'm going to have a quick look at what really happens when someone says bob or single. And we'll discuss sets of rules that you follow at these times versus trying to use the place notation to actually make more sense of that. And then we'll finish off with a little bit on visualizing the paths of the bells and naming different patterns of work that we might encounter. So first of all, circles of work. So circles of work are a very common way of learning plain methods where most of the work is happening at the lead end. So when in most cases when the treble leads, there's a dodge or there's some places and so on. And so many people will be familiar with this sort of diagram in the top left, which is the circle of work for plain bob minor, showing where each bell starts and the order in which the work comes. So the circle of work is actually just an abbreviated form of the blue line. It misses out the plain hunting between each of these bits of work and just kind of makes it very concise and easy to understand. The problem is that many methods have additional work going on between the treble leading and would be too complicated to represent in this format. So here we've got the method double Oxford bob minor, and we can see that if we wanted to draw a circle of work for this, it's going to be quite cluttered because we need to include a triple dodge here, as well as this dodge at the start of the next place bell. Then we've got these places in the middle with another dodge. Then we've got a triple dodge here that kind of goes over the starting point to the fifth, and so on. So it becomes too complicated quite quickly. Therefore, we switch to the blue lines, and this is one reason why they are so useful, and why many people will have a diagrams book that they use very often. But the blue line also has additional useful information. It's not just this blue line that we're interested in. It also tells us which bells dodge together. So we can have a look and see that if we're on the second at the beginning of double Oxford, then we're going to be dodging with the fourth in a plain course. That can be helpful. We can also look at where we pass the treble, for example. And as we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides, where you pass the treble can be really quite informative. So therefore, I would advise that as well as using circles of work, I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't use these because they're incredibly useful. But at the beginning of your method ringing career, I would advise getting used to looking at and also writing out the blue lines as well as learning the circle of work. The sooner you start to learn how to read and write the blue lines, the easier you'll find it to move on to more complex things. So on to the next point, the hunt bell as a landmark. So this obviously only applies to hunter type methods, but they're the main ones that we ring. So this is hopefully useful in most cases. So from the simplest to the most complex of methods, the hunt bell is really crucial. It's a landmark that can be extremely helpful. And you know, if you ever talk to someone who rings spliced surprise Maximus, then they'll still tell you that one of the most important things you can have in your band is someone who rings the treble well, because the hunt bell is so important. And I'm going to claim that the most important landmark of all is the lead end change when the hunt bell is leading at the front. There are obviously other useful landmarks. So this is what I would say is the most important one, but there are lots of others that you can look out for. This includes where you pass the hunt bell, as we said on the last slide, and also the half lead change, which is when the hunt bell is making a place at the back. And we talked a little bit about that when we were looking at place notation. So why am I claiming that this lead end is so important? Well, it's the point at which the hunt bell returns to its initial position, and it marks the point on the blue line where you transition from the work of one working bell onto the work of the next working bell. So another way of saying that is that each time you get to one of these lead ends, you're taking over from another bell where it would start on the line. So after we rung this first lead on the second, we then take over from where the fourth was at the beginning of the playing course. So the section of blue line between one lead end change and the next is termed a place bell, and each place bell is given a number based on the starting position of the blue line in that lead. So basically here the blue line starts in third position, so this is termed third place bell. Fourth place bell is here, and second place bell is here. So if you've ever asked someone, what do I do first in plain bob minor when I'm ringing the fourth, essentially the question you've been asking is, what's fourth place bell in plain bob minor? So you may feel like this is a question that people only ask when they start, but I can promise you that plenty of people who ring much more complicated things will also be asking the same question. They just do it in a slightly more technical way. So what do we mean when we say learning by place bells? Why do we think place bells are so important? Well, when we first learn methods at the start of our method ringing careers, what we tend to do is learn a separate line for each bell. For example, ringing plain bob minimus on the left here, most people would think of the second as this string of work. So we'd have 3/4 down, 3/4 up, and seconds. And then we'd know that on the third, we start with seconds, then we do 3/4 down and 3/4 up. But then if we're told to ring the fourth, we then think, okay, well, on the fourth, I do this, I do 3/4 up seconds and 3/4 down. Now, of course, we all know that this is a circle. We've talked about circles of work. We know that the bells are on the same path. They're just starting in different places. But we still, I would say, tend to think of these three different working bells as three kind of separate strands that we remember individually. But when we talk about learning by place bells, we don't just look at the work that our bell is going to do in the order that it's going to do it. We also have to take note of when we reach the starting position of one of the other bells. So going back to bob minimus as an example, we now, ringing the second, instead of just saying 3/4 down, 3/4 up seconds, we would actually start by saying, okay, at the beginning, we're going to ring seconds place bell. That seems obvious, but thinking about it in that way requires a slightly different frame of mind. So we're going to start by ringing second place bell, which contains as part of its work 3/4 down. But then when we get to the 3/4 down, instead of just thinking now it's 3/4 up next, we're actually going to think in addition that we're starting fourth place bell here. So we've rung seconds place bell, we've finished that lead, and at the start of this next lead, we're ringing fourth place bell. And of course, we still do 3/4 up next time because that is the work of fourth place bell. And similarly, we then, when we get to the 3/4 up dodge, as well as doing that dodge, we also take note of the fact that we're starting third place bell. And then, of course, we have to do our seconds to finish off. And we would be about to ring seconds place bell again, but it's quite likely that we would end up in rounds and the method would be over. So you may ask, if it's as simple as this, why would I bother going the extra mile to think about it in this way? Well, the answer is because it's not always as simple as this, and knowing when you start the next place bell and what that place bell's work is can be very useful. And here are some reasons why. So as things become more complex, breaking the blue line down into these chunks of 1 lead long can be very helpful in making the learning more manageable. So if you're used to ringing plain bob, say plain bob minor, and you look at the line for Cambridge surprise minor for the first time, your initial thought may be, there's no way I can ever cope with that. But if you split it down into smaller chunks, one way of doing that is by learning the place spells, then you can make it more manageable. Another reason why place spells are important is that the lead end, so the start of the place spell, is a very common place for conductors to try and correct errors and put people back on their lines. And this is often done by telling people which place spell they're either about to start or have just started ringing. So if you know your place spells and the conductor says to you, ring this place spell, then you've got a pretty good chance of being able to find your way back to where you should be. And the third reason is that calls can change which place spell you're going to ring in the next lead. So if you want to be prepared for what to do next, you need to know those place spells by heart. So you may be about to ring third's place spell, but the call may actually mean that you end up ringing second's place spell. So you suddenly need to switch from being prepared to ring third's place spell to being ready to ring second's place spell. And if you know the place spells, then that's much simpler to do than trying to remember, oh, what would I do if I was starting the method on the second now? So how can we go about learning in this way? Well, here are a few tips, but it's certainly not exhaustive, this list, and I would recommend that you ask experienced bringers for advice on this as well. I'm sure they can give you some other tips. So one big piece of advice is to spend time learning the blue lines, especially the work that happens during each place spell. Which place spell you would become next after ringing a particular one. This changes from method to method. The order of the place spells is different in some methods to others. And also thinking about which bell you'll become if a call is put in at the end of the lead. So what place spell would I be if there's a bob at the end of this lead? Doing that in your own time when not ringing can really help to cement this knowledge in your head and make it easier to remember when you're ringing a bell. There are also things you can do while you're ringing. So a big one is trying to spot when the hunt bell is leading. That's when the lead end is. And if you can see when the treble is in lead, then it will help you to spot when this change is taking place. Also, it can be helpful to make a mental note of the exact blow in most methods in even bell methods. No, sorry, I'll change that. In most methods, this is at the backstroke. You're going to start each place spell at a backstroke change. I hope I've got that right. So make a mental note of exactly when that blow is. So say to yourself, now I am third's place spell. That can be really helpful. And as well as making sure that during the lead, you're doing all of your plain hunting, all of your dodging, all of your places, also try and always keep in mind which place spell you are at the moment and which you will be at the next lead end. Because then that means that when the lead end change comes around, you haven't forgotten where you're going next. But a warning is to not forget that dodges, as we can see here, places and even some longer chunks of work can very easily be happening across, as we say, across the lead end change. So whilst these place spell chunks are handy to help you digest the method, you need to remember that they have to be stitched together as well, and that during the method, this stuff is going to be, it's still going to be happening all in one coherent line. So, you know, you want to learn second's place spell, but you need to remember that at the end of second's place spell, you're actually dodging back to become fourth place spell. You're not just learning this plain hunt and then forgetting that you have to stick it onto the next bit. So the last major part of the talk, which hopefully I'll get through in good time, is having a look at what really happens when the conductor shouts bob or single. So you may be someone who's occasionally rung a new method, and you might have asked the conductor or one of the other ringers, what happens at a bob or a single in this new method? And they'll just say to you, oh, don't worry, it's just the same as plain bob. And you think, well, what on earth does that mean? How can it be the same, just the same as in plain bob? How can they be the same if you're ringing a different method? Are they even correct? Well, I would say that the answer is both yes and no, and I'll try and show why. So work at a bob and single in plain bob. So this is plain bob minor we're looking at now, and some people will recognize this sort of table. This is from a website which I think I included the link to. This I can't remember exactly what it was now, but this is a pretty standard table showing you what happens when the conductor makes a call in plain bob minor. So we've got an about to do column, then we've got a what happens if a bob is called, what happens if a single is called. So these specific rules only apply to plain bob minor. So this particular table is specific to plain bob minor. I've said only. There may be one or two minor variations of plain bob minor which would also have the same rules. I don't know, but basically this is a bespoke table that will tell you all the things that happen at the calls in plain bob minor. Sorry about that. Some bits will certainly also apply to other methods, but as a whole, they're pretty specific to this particular method. So to see what people mean when they say it is just the same as plain bob, we need to go back and look at place notation again. So in most cases, a call, a bob or a single, replaces the normal place notation with a different instruction for just one single change. And this is usually at the lead end change. Now I've put in a couple of stars here. There are calls that can affect multiple changes in a lead, but this isn't very common. And calls can take effect away from the lead end change. And Grancer is a good example of this. But on the whole, this is what happens. And after this different instruction, this altered change, the normal place notation starts again straight away. So after this single change where we've got something slightly different happening, the bells then follow the same path as they would if they were back in a plain course until the next call or until the method comes round. So let's take a look and see if we can actually display that, what I've just said, in an understandable way. So this requires us to remember the place notation shorthand from the last part of the talk. So plain bob minor, the lead end notation, as we looked at last time, is normally 1, 2. This means we have a place made in position number 1, which is the hunt bell, the treble, and we have a place made in position number 2. This is seconds, and then the other bells all swap. So we get two dodges at the back in plain bob minor. So when a bob is called in plain bob minor, the lead end notation changes to 1, 4. So this is the single change that I was talking about. One row, one change between two rows that's different, and the rest of the place notation is exactly the same. So the next row, the place notation returns to a cross, all the bells swapping exactly as it would in the normal method. So what's happened here? So the place that we have in seconds place in the normal lead end, that's been moved out to fourths here. What effect does this have on the bells? So clearly the bell that was about to make seconds no longer makes that place. The pair that we're going to dodge in 3, 4, they can't swap anymore because there's a place going on in fourths. And the bell that happens to be in fourths at the start of this change, the top row of this change, that bell has to make the place in fourths. So this is what this 1, 4 means in terms of the bells that were about to do a 1, 2. And so therefore, what are the consequences of this? Well, the hunt bell still leads because its instruction, this 1, hasn't changed. The bell that's in fourth has to do this place. So this is what is called making the bob. This is where making the bob comes from. This 4 that's appeared in the notation forces this bell to make the bob there. the pair in 2 and 3 have to swap. They're stuck between this place here and this place here. The notation hasn't got anything between the 1 and the 4, so that means that 2 and 3 positions have to cross over, and this is what's referred to as running in and running out. So this swap is what leads to running in and running out. And actually what's happening is that the bell that was about to become 4th place bell here, that's forced to run in and start 2nd place bell. And the bell that was about to make seconds is forced to run out and become 3rd place bell. The 2 at the back, this change in the notation hasn't affected them at all. So that's why they remain unaffected. They still swap. There's no 5 or 6 here, no 5 or 6 here. So does thinking about it in this way really help us? Well, unlike the table of rules, which we saw a few slides ago, which is specific to a particular method, the rules that I've described on the previous slide, they apply to all of the methods where we have a 1-2 change at the lead end, which is altered to a 1-4 when a bob is called. So any method that has this change at a bob will have the consequences that we've discussed. And it doesn't matter if it's on a higher stage, if there's more bells at the back, then they just carry on doing what they would do anyway. So when you combine this knowledge with knowing the method's place bells, you've actually got all the information you need to deal with the bob in any method that has this setup. So this is always going to be the case. The bell that was going to dodge to become 4th place bell, that doesn't become 4th place bell, it's forced to run in and become 2nd place bell. So then as long as you know 2nd place bell, you can carry on quite happily and know exactly what's coming next. The bell that was going to be 2nd place bell now is forced to run out and becomes 3rd place bell. So it's the position of the bells on this row here that's crucial, the start of the next lead. So this bell runs out, and the bell that's making the bob, this is the one that has to do this new 4 notation. This becomes 4th place bell and starts the lead from that position. So we've gone from having a table that's specific to the method that we're ringing to having a set of rules that allows us to deal with this situation in any method that has this setup. But what about other calls and other methods? Well, obviously I need to finish this talk tonight. So what I've done here is I've just talked about the most common calls. So many methods that we ring commonly have a 1-2 lead end notation. This is, I'd say, probably the most common lead end notation. And these methods are usually rung with a bob that causes a 1-4 notation. So this is probably, I'd say, the most common situation. Methods that have this lead end notation, a single in those methods is usually 1, 2, 3, 4 here, rather than just 1, 4. There are some methods, such as Kent, treble bob minor, that have a 1, 6 notation at the lead end. So instead of a place here and a place here, we have the hunt bell leading, but we have a place at the back. They usually also use 1, 4 bobs. So now what you can do if you want is you can apply what we've just talked about to the method plain bob minor, if you like, using a 1, 2, 3, 4 single, and you can go through the same process and see what happens. Or you could take Kent treble bob minor, which has the 1, 6 lead end notation, and you can apply a 1, 4 bob to that method, and again see what happens, and see if you can work out for yourself exactly what goes on. This is a topic that maybe will be discussed in more detail in another talk, but I think for the time being, that's probably enough on that. So the last 2 slides will be very quick. I'm just in time for what I was aiming for. So the final way we can use blue lines is probably the one that most people think of the most often. So we can see, we can visualize the path that our bell is taking. Some people use their visual memory more than others, but I think almost everyone would look at a blue line and use it to try and remember the pattern that the bell follows. Now, it's important to say that some people read the line vertically, I do, but other people will turn the diagrams book or the sheet of paper on its side and look at it more like a mountainscape. And that's absolutely fine. It's all about choosing the best method for you. But I would say that ultimately, we can't use these blue lines to help us ring while we're actually ringing. And so it does need to be in your head. And I think spending time learning blue lines is very valuable time spent, and is certainly not a waste of effort. If you talk to people who ring very complicated methods, almost all of them will tell you that they spend a lot of time learning blue lines, memorizing them, making sure they can write out those place bells or recite the place bells at seconds notice. And actually putting in that hard work can be incredibly useful to help you ring methods with fewer mistakes. So this is the last section. So you'll probably all be aware that to help us learn these blue lines, distinctive patterns of work are often given some sort of name. Not only does this help us to memorize longer sections of work more easily by a kind of assigning a pattern to them, it can also be used to help learn other methods that contain that same pattern. Almost every ringer who's rung methods will know what the pattern of plain hunt, for example, looks like, probably what a dodge looks like, and a place, and so on. But you will encounter other patterns as you progress onto more and more methods, and it's a good idea to try and identify which ones are common and learn those names well. So just on the very last slide to finish, here are a few commonly named patterns of work. I stole this slide from Richard Pargeter, so thank you very much. So as we said, we've got a dodge, here's a place, treble bob we've talked about as a pattern that we've seen in treble dodging methods. We've got things like fish tails, which possibly look like the tail of a fish, although you could argue it looks like the mouth of a fish as well. Cat's ears, which are obvious when there's cat's eyes drawn on. And then there are some more specific technical pieces of work. This pattern is called Cambridge places. Anybody who's rung Cambridge surprise at any stage will be familiar with these. But as Richard's pointed out here, this is 16 blows of work that are described in 3 words. So having this name for this pattern makes it a lot easier than dodge 3-4, force thirds, dodge 3-4, force thirds, dodge 3-4. It's a bit of a mouthful. So there are lots of these named patterns. Some might have different names in different towers. That's perfectly possible. So it is worth finding out what the commonly named pieces of work that people use in your tower or in your local group of ringers. And again, as with memorizing the blue lines, it's a good idea to try and get these in your head nice and firmly. I'm going to finish there. That's all. Thank you for listening. I don't think I ran over by too much from the 9 p.m. limit that I set myself. I do hope that this has been useful for some people. Thank you for the feedback after the first part, and I hope the second part was okay as well. But I will stop there and see what's been happening in the chat.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Yeah, so not much in the way of questions. I think while you're talking, Philip George confirmed that he has named a method, great grandson surprise minor, having rung it in a quarter. So I think good agreement on that point. I think if people would like to ask any questions, now's a good time. You can either do it using the raise your hand or just type it into the chat window. It might be worthwhile just going over the forthcoming programme. Next event will be on Saturday, this coming Saturday, so 2 days' time. We're going to have a learners drop-in session at 10 o'clock in the morning, details to be published. The next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, which is Tom Ridgman, talking about the care of bells and belfries. And then the next talk after that will be David Pipe a week tomorrow, which is Friday the 17th, which will be an introduction to conducting. There we have a question from Christopher Lewis Brown. Stephen, yeah, the origins of surprise, delight, alliance, and
well,
terms like that.
Yeah, so I don't know about surprise and delight. I feel like Treble Bob is probably fairly obvious, but then I don't know where surprise and delight come from. Alliance, I've always thought that would be due to the path of the hunt bell being kind of an alliance between one type and another, but that could be completely wrong. I don't have anything to back that up. If anybody else knows, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the alliance methods, they typically need to be allied. So alliance methods typically need to be allied with a little method to make sure that the treble rings the same number of blows in each place. So a typical alliance method would be plain hunt up to some number and then treble bob beyond that is quite common for the alliance methods. And that allows you to get an extent, you know, i.e. with no repeated rows in. But yeah, I don't know about the surprise or delight.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying that surprise certainly is a term that goes back a long way. So at least back into the 1800s. I'm not sure when the first surprise methods were rung, but it's not a recent definition, and therefore I would suspect that there wasn't much. I think it was probably more of a kind of organic thing rather than sitting down and deciding that this type of method would be this and that type of method would be that. But if anyone does know the answer to that question, that would be quite interesting to know.
Okay.
I would like to make just one more point. I've tried to make the slides that I wrote stand up on their own so that people can go back through them and if they didn't quite understand when I went through it, to go through at their own speed and maybe work through some of the examples. If anybody takes the slides and feels that there are things in there that aren't clear, then please let me know, because I can always edit them a little bit and try and improve them if that's needed. Okay, great. And yeah, obviously you'll have the email address on the follow-up email that will arrive tomorrow, but education@cambridgeringing.info is how to get a hold of us. As I think I mentioned last time, if you've got any requests or suggestions for talks that you'd like to hear in the future, please do let us know and we'll try and get them into the schedule. But I think, oh, hello. Jenny has asked, is there going to be an opportunity for people to ask about terminology at the learner session? Absolutely, it's exactly the kind of thing that we'll be working through. So, you know, I think, yeah, we're planning to operate the learners chat session as a almost ask me anything. So we'll arrange for a couple of experienced people to be around and you know, just ask away any question, and the answer will either be I know the answer to that or I don't know the answer to that, and both are fine. Okay, so but unless there are any other questions that people would like to ask, I think we can probably close it here. Thank you very much again, Stephen. Again, thank you all for listening.
Yeah, it's quite daunting going early on in the sequence of talks. So, yeah. All right, wonderful. Thank you all very much, and we'll call it a night there.
Bye.
Bye.